Hello, everyone. I wanted to give just a brief overview of week two. It's a general idea of week two. Well, in week one, we started looking at the basis for the course, which is the idea that engineering is a profession, and that generally a profession brings with it certain duties and responsibilities, and that engineering specifically brings with it its own duties and responsibility, and that no doubt the most important part of that is the first canon. Now, we're looking at the NSPE code, the National Society of Professional Engineers code, which is meant to apply to all engineers, not just PEs. But there are other codes, as people discussed in the discussion boards last week. There's a code of ethics, I think, for every engineering society: electrical engineers, mechanical engineers, civil engineers, etc. But I think the NSPE is the most well developed one and is probably the only one that is meant to be a umbrella for all engineers, not engineers in specific fields. The other thing that is great about the NSPE is the Board of Ethical Review, which we'll begin to look at this week, cases from the Board of Ethical Review. The Board of Ethical Review is a rotating body of PEs who come up with these decisions. And they are perhaps the greatest resource there is in engineering ethics, the one sort of irreplaceable resource. And if we look at typical BER case, just look at the case for Wednesday 01-10, employment expense paid trip by prospective employer. Every BER case will have the same structure. First, there'll be a set of facts which will lay out the ethical scenario. Then there'll be the ethical question that the board asks. That is, given these facts, what is it that stands out as it being unresolved, interesting ethical significance? And then the references, that is, the parts of the code that they think are most relevant to the question and to the facts. And then the heart of the case, which is the discussion, in which they try to make up their minds about the question. That is, in this case, was it ethical for engineer A to accept the invitation? Some, wide-ranging discussion of the case with a lot of references to other cases. And in that way, a BER discussion is much like a legal one in the common law tradition, where you reason by analogy to other cases that are similar enough that they would provide guidance for how to decide this case. That's a very important part of the way that the BER, the Board of Ethical Review, approaches the situation. And then finally, a conclusion here. And the conclusion here that the engineer did, in fact, act unethically. First of all, these cases might be based on real events, and they might not. And even the ones that are based on real events are not necessarily accurate to those events, nor are they meant to be. These cases are purely teaching cases. They are for us. They are for exactly what we're doing. People who are looking for guidance in engineering ethics. They are not. They don't carry with them any power for sanctions against engineers. That's another matter entirely. They're really for teaching purposes. So we're looking at two cases this week: 01-10 and I think 05-3. And what's the idea of these cases? Well, we've been introduced to the idea of engineering as a profession. I've suggested that the most important principle in engineering ethics, considered as professional ethics, is the first canon, the hold paramount, the safety, health, and welfare of the public. That is, the most important cases in engineering ethics are the ones that involve public safety. As I heard an engineer say recently, involves safety critical aspects of engineering. And that's true, but I don't think that's where we should start. That is, I think it's better to start with cases that are really not that big a deal. Um, not getting back to somebody, not returning somebody's messages, and taking a trip that may be perhaps taking advantage of the prospective employer. Those things are not all that important. Compared with public safety, they're not all that important. But that's where I want to start. That is, I think that one of the aspects of being a professional, if you really are a member of a profession, that is, if you as an engineer are really a member of a profession called engineering, then you have to hold yourself perhaps to a higher ethical standard. So things that would be very small matters if they were simply occurred in business become larger matters if they involve a professional, because a professional has a certain duty to uphold certain standards of behavior. So, in the case of a business person not getting back to a customer, that may just be foolish in terms of business, but it probably wouldn't be unethical. Whereas an engineer, if an engineer is a professional, not getting back to a client is not just foolish or bad business. It may rise to the level of an ethical lapse, as they say. It may be a moral issue. I would say the same thing with the second case, the one about this one, 01-10, about the young engineering graduate taking advantage of a prospective employer basically to get a free vacation trip. That may not be such a big deal, and in the world of business may not even be an ethical issue. But in the world of the professions, because the person, the individual, is a member of a profession, they have a certain duty to uphold standards. And so that falling below those standards, which may be for a non professional, just not an important matter before a professional becomes an important matter. So I like to start on this more trivial level because I think it really does point out or point up or emphasize the supposed distinction between being a professional and not being a professional.